Good evening, everyone. It's 7:02, and I think we've got a quorum here. It's great to see so many people coming to the community speaker series. Sometimes we don't have as large an audience as we'd like to. And I suspect it's got to do with our speaker and the particular topic. Just want to say at the start, we're going to film this, and so if you don't want to be on videotape, you should get out of the firing line of Vince's camera. Thanks again for coming, and thanks to Kathy for volunteering to come and talk about this issue. Yeah, well, we didn't twist your arm. When I was looking through all the documentation regarding, everything that you do, and aside from Kathy's publication record, I think it's important to know that she's not just a professor in the Faculty of Education. She has roles as Acting Associate Director at the Center for Education, Research and Innovation, Cross-Appointment Department of Medical Imaging, and Research Associate, Professional Practice Education and Learning, Sterling University, Research Fellow, Center for Education, Research and Innovation, and core member of the Interdisciplinarity Network for Scholarship in Professions, Research and Education. That's a lot of work. So again, thanks for taking time to be here. What I wanted to say really was, from my point of view, this topic is of real interest to me because my experience with the news media is that a catastrophe happens and it's on the front page for 2 weeks and everybody watches it and they think, my goodness, how could anybody recover from what happened in Fukushima? And then it disappears after about a month. And you wonder how they managed to rebuild. And Kathy is going to address that tonight. And I don't want to steal your thunder, but I'm going to read from a story that Corey, our Impact Communications Director? Officer. Had to say in an article that was produced on the faculty homepage. When Japanese nuclear officials and their colleagues at the IAEA were keen to document what they learned during the management of the Fukushima crisis and incorporated it into a revised curriculum for first responders, they called Kathy. There was a lot of concern about not losing, this is Kathy's words, not losing the lessons that they'd learned, but these were scientists with no real experience documenting those type of learnings in a meaningful way or integrating them into educational curriculum. So that became my task, Kathy's task. Officials sent Kathy data from interviews they had conducted with emergency first responders so they could use the information in her curriculum. And Kathy says, my goal was to keep the stories alive. I conducted a narrative analysis of the interviews that had been done by the nuclear radiation specialist and reorganized them and wrote them into narrative stories, which are far more memorable and a terrific tool from which to learn. And I think that's what you're going to be talking about, so I won't say any more. Please join me in welcoming Kathy.
Thanks, everybody. And yes, Karen, do I want the light to maybe just a touch? I don't want anybody sleeping, though. You can adjust them if you think you can't see the slides as we go. I brought slides not because I wanted to present at you, but because I have some pictures that I want to share with you. And I can't put some of what I experienced into words, and so I thought this would be a good place to start. Steve, who is our Associate Dean of Research, by the way, Steve, did you mention? I don't know what.
No, I assumed everyone already knew this.
So, Steve Bird's our Associate Dean of Research, and he mentioned the IAEA in the introduction. For those of you who are not familiar, the IAEA is the International Atomic Energy Agency, and they are an organization within the United Nations that was set up in 1957, I believe, to look after, regulate the nuclear safety and security and peaceful use of nuclear energy. And so I had started working with them about, it's almost 8 years ago now, on a number of educational projects, education-related projects. As I was just speaking with a fellow here tonight, they're responsible for developing and promoting programs in all their member states, and they've got all kinds of resources that are shared generously from first world countries, but they don't understand or recognize the context that they're going into. So that's kind of the backdoor, I guess, way that I found myself as a teacher in this context. Because a lot of people ask me, what are you doing going to Japan? I've spent more than 30 years in education, but I have to say that I hadn't really thought a whole lot about nuclear disasters or radiation or any of those things. But I've been thinking an awful lot about it lately. How many of you in this room are in some way, shape, or form an educator? Not necessarily in the familiar sense, formal sense of schools, but okay. I'm glad to see that, Jacob. Starting young. That's good to know, because I'm gonna call on you to do some work with me tonight. I want to start by asking if anybody'd like to venture a guess at what this is a picture of. Don't be shy.
That is probably Fukushima, the nuclear reactor.
That's a good guess, John. But it's actually the Bruce.
Not even close.
Well, it is in fact close. As I got into this work and traveled to Fukushima, it started to make me a little more aware of just where we are located. Because I realized that the distance between the Bruce plant to London and the Darlington plant to London was really quite similar to the distance between the city of Fukushima and the Denai and Dashai. So you can see the Dashai plant is there, the Denai plant is there, and we're similar distances to the city of Fukushima. And the story that I'm talking to you about tonight takes place in the city of Fukushima, in the prefecture or the region of Fukushima. So sometimes people get a little confused. We did not travel to the evacuation zone at all. We went to Fukushima Medical University to work with the first medical responders who have shared their stories with us, who found themselves, because of their location, as the Grand Central location for taking in all of the casualties and contaminated patients. And it was an interesting position for them to be in. There were hospitals that were closer, but as the danger area was expanded, those hospitals were also closed down and evacuated. So this hospital was not prepared to become the center for radiation, but they didn't have a choice. And that's part of what this story is about. For those of you who are not terribly familiar with what happened, it's often referred to now as 3/11 because it happened on March the 11th, 2011. And it's referred to as a perfect storm. A perfect storm because it began with an earthquake that was felt. It was a 9.0 earthquake, which was felt even in the hospital in Fukushima City. They have pictures for our librarians I want to share with them sometimes of 80,000 books that hit the floor, and other damage that was done in the hospital, but the building itself stayed standing. And they were about 60 kilometers from the quake. That quake, of course, unleashed a tsunami which took 20,000 lives, and did irreparable damage to a number of communities. And then the effects of both of those were what led to the nuclear meltdown. I don't know about you, but I have colleagues and friends that use the term nuclear meltdown when they're talking about having a bad day. And this experience has sort of brought that into my attention. There's nothing compares to that experience. That crisis unleashed a mix of chaos and fear, but also of courageous action. Many residents suffered injuries. There were no deaths that were attributed to radiation exposure at this point. There was one fellow who died who was a worker in the plant, but his death was attributed to other causes. 20,000 at least were lost in the tsunami. But there's little that they know about this kind of exposure, which is much lower than something like a Chernobyl or like some of the nuclear bombs, but over a longer period of time. And so they're in a process of trying to gather information, working in the absence of information, and working at a time when the earthquake has taken out roads, trains. Fukushima has no water. There's no gasoline. Grocery stores are empty. Nobody has access to communication systems. The televisions worked, and they got their information by watching TV. There were a few satellite phones, but they were in, limited use. You had to take a turn using them. So I want you to imagine, as we're talking about these experiences, what it would be like if we were suddenly finding ourselves in a situation where those things that we depend on daily are off the table. Okay? This is Jun Shigemura. He is a psychiatrist, and he is one of the physicians who ran to the crisis. As you can imagine, when something like this happens, there is all kinds of information coming out, some accurate, some inaccurate, and people were making personal decisions about whether to stay or whether to go, and that was true for healthcare professionals as well as emergency responders. So there were a limited number of people left behind at Fukushima to deal with the unknown. They didn't know how many they were going to receive. They had started receiving them, but they didn't know what they were facing. So the television news advertised that they needed psychiatrists, they needed mental health support. And Jun heard this call and decided that he had to go. I want you now to listen. I'm going to give you an opportunity to hear from one of the participants' stories. And I want you to think like an educator. And those of you that aren't educators, you can imagine some ideas in terms of what would we have to do? What can we learn from just this one story? If this were to happen to us. So,
as the first medical responders rushed to the area to help, they became very concerned about the situation within the restriction zone. When they were finally allowed in to assess the workers' overall health, doctors found people overwhelmed by the stress that they had been experiencing. The workers in the restricted zone had literally been working day and night on top of experiencing multiple traumas. Imagine a nuclear plant exploding in front of you. Imagine the fear of radiation exposure after just fleeing a tsunami that just claimed 20,000 lives. Imagine trying to find cover from debris falling from the sky after your workplace exploded. They were convinced that they would die. Given these conditions, a plea for mental health support was sent out through the media, on television, in newspapers, and magazines. I was so concerned about the Fukushima plant workers that when I saw the plea for help on television, I had to call. Because of the safety concerns in Daiichi, a medical clinic was set up in Daini to take care of both Daiichi and Daini workers. Many of the workers were also evacuees. Some of the workers went to temporary shelters, but because they could not go home and because they just returned from work, they were still wearing their blue TEPCO uniforms. But when their neighbors saw the workers, they yelled at them, "What are you doing here? You work for TEPCO? You have to go back to the plant." The public blamed TEPCO for both the disaster and the post-disaster management. They were very angry, and since the CEO is not nearby or visible to them, the workers in blue uniforms became the easy targets of public anger, criticism, discrimination, harassment, and assault. It is very sad. Here, they are technicians working very hard in a life or death environment in order to stabilize the plant, and they are subjected to further trauma. They were experiencing such a difficult time, and I asked myself, what can I do? I'm just a psychiatrist. I had a specialize in disaster psychiatry, but this was my first experience on site. There were about 2,000 employees. I could not possibly meet with every single person. I also realized that they needed much more than just consulting or medication. They needed to have their honor restored. They were risking their life to save people. As we worked with the employees over the next few months, conducting research helped us understand that they were experiencing basically 4 types of stressors. 1. Workplace trauma, like plant explosion or radiation, etc. 2. Disaster victim experience. Most of the workers live near Daiichi and Daini because that's where they work, so they had to evacuate. Their homes were located within the restricted zone. Some people, of course, lost their properties in the tsunami. 3. Grief experience. Daiichi lost 2 young employees to the tsunami. At Daini, 1 contractor also died from the tsunami. Nobody died from the radiation exposure, but there were those 2 disaster-related deaths. When somebody dies in your workplace, it is a serious trauma because those workers were checking the plant, checking to see if everything is okay. It is very tragic for their co-workers because it is so close and they realize it could have been them. 4. Criticism from the public. Our analysis told us that it was discrimination that was hurting them the most. Those with discrimination experiences were 2 to 3 times more likely to have adverse mental health outcomes compared to those who did not experience it. Those outcomes could include anxiety, depression, PTSD, or any other disorder. And there are social consequences. For example, if a girlfriend finds a boyfriend from TEPCO, can she get engaged to him and take her new boyfriend to meet her family? So sadly, TEPCO people feel that they have no future in their lives. They are not able to speak out that they work for TEPCO. They cannot proudly tell their children that they are doing such difficult and important work, so it affects them in so many ways. We can learn from lessons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki because those victims were labeled as Hibakusha. If you translate that from Japanese, it would mean the exposed people. Social awareness is a key to solve this issue because I think that's the primary factor to fight against discrimination. And of course, there are the long-term outcomes: loss of motivation, depression, increased alcohol consumption, and increase of human error. People always make mistakes, and when you are not feeling psychologically well, you are more likely to make mistakes. I personally think that it is a social responsibility to maintain those workers' mental health, because if something goes wrong again in Fukushima plant, everybody is going to be in trouble. The ultimate solution to discrimination is to speak out. When people are discriminated against, they become fearful and silent. Rather than imagining the struggles of the workers, it's easier to discriminate or ignore them. This is a vicious cycle of stigma. The ultimate way to get rid of that is to speak out and let the public know that there is discrimination going on. We knew we needed to get this message out beyond the scientific or academic community. To raise public awareness, we did interviews with BBC, The Guardian, New York Times, AP News Network, and Japanese media, among others. We had to learn how to reduce an important scientific message into a 10-second media soundbite. And we had to do this in a context where the public were experiencing sensationalized media reports. It was so difficult for the layperson to understand that there is no 100% safety or 100% danger. Reality is usually somewhere in between the two extremes. But it was very challenging for the scientists and the media to address that. I am not criticizing anyone. I'm just telling a fact that mass media tend to be very sensational. If they provide a sensational program, that would mean a lot of viewers. However, it is a different story whether the story is scientifically correct or not. I think the scientific community and the media both need to work together, and I believe this is an important educational opportunity for our country. I think everybody deserves care. We need to have equality in providing care, and TEPCO is no exception. There are various cases in medicines where you need to provide care to the last person that you really want to take care of. For example, you need to take care of criminals. If you are in a war, you need to take care of your enemy if they are wounded, even if they are your enemy. That's written in the Geneva Convention. So there are those challenging moments in medicine, but I really need to focus on just one thing. Everybody needs care. TEPCO workers' duties are so public. If they screw something up, it's going to screw up this country. I really need to be neutral. And while I have to think about politics, I try not to allow politics into my medical practice. As a medical professional, the best thing I can do is to provide evidence and to promote to the public that this issue is still ongoing and that you need to support those people. If you don't support them, there will be a delay in the recovery process, which is not good for anyone. I've been telling the public on various occasions the importance of appreciation to those workers. Of course, I can only speak to a limited number of audiences, but it is an important thing, and if that goes on the media, it's going to be a powerful tool in order to send a message. Our team have been providing more than ordinary mental health care. We need to understand the broader organizational perspective as well as the psychological trauma experience. It's not just psychiatry, it is disaster psychiatry, occupational psychiatry, and social psychiatry. Furthermore, it is not limited to psychiatry. We need to think about radiology, public health, sociology. I really don't want to think about politics, but I always have to keep that in mind. All that is not an easy thing. Hopefully, our approach will be applicable to other populations in the future. For example, what will happen if a nuclear disaster breaks out in another country? What happens if biological or chemical terrorism happens somewhere? As you know, there is a similarity on public responses between nuclear and biochemical threats. The agents are invisible, and public responses can be overwhelming. We have a lot to apply our experiences to similar accidents in the future. I have to confess, I learned a lot from the public responses to SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, H1N1 influenza, and other terrorist attacks because they have similarities with the nuclear crisis. This country needs to live with the Fukushima plants for a few decades, so it is important for medical students and other professions to know about post-nuclear disaster mental health issue. They are the ones who will have to face this issue in the future. I just think we need to be collaborative. We can't just stick to one specialty, because in nuclear or biochemical attacks or whatever, it is a multidisciplinary challenge. Education on multiple tiers is very important. When providing education, it should not be on one special field. It should be collaborative communication efforts between multiple disciplines such as science, media, and the public. One optimistic lesson that we learned from Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they are now very vibrant cities. People had started to live there immediately after the nuclear bomb attacks. No one knows how much radiation dose was at that time, but people were resilient. People had revived the city, and we can see a similar future for Fukushima. It may come from what people in the mental health professional call peer support. When a government says you need to do this, people may not necessarily follow them. But if somebody who has shared similar experiences tells them, I've been through this, you can go do this too. That's a strong message. I think it has been so important that people from Hiroshima and Nagasaki University have come to provide support to the people in Fukushima. This act gives courage and to provide well-being to the people in Fukushima. I've been very fortunate and privileged to work with the hardworking workers of the Fukushima Daiichi and Daini plants. We now know it could have been much worse, and Japan could have been divided in 3 regions, a no man's land in Tohoku and Kanto, and 2 parts on the north and south. I really respect those workers for their bravery, their hard work, and their sacrifices. I feel so honored to be with them. I deeply wish the general public would acknowledge and provide appreciation to these workers because they really deserve that honor.
Okay, that's a taste. There are hundreds of pages of transcripts that we went through. And I think that gives you a little bit of a sense of one response, one experience. So what came to mind when you think about that story and education? What popped into your mind? Don't all raise your hands at once, yes.
How unprepared everyone was?
That was a very strong and common theme across all of the interviews. Despite their history, they were certainly sensitive to it, and I'll explain where in a little bit later. But they were all absolutely convinced that they were safe, that this would not happen, that it could not happen. Now, of course, the rear view mirror is always a little bit easier to look back and say, well, there were a couple of reports that actually modeled a tsunami earthquake experience, and those do exist, but nobody expected this to happen. Nobody that we spoke to expected this to happen. What else?
I would imagine there was probably a lot of fear predicated on ignorance.
On ignorance of what could happen, what might be happening, what was going to happen, all of those. And in fact, Shun has continued to work on this project because one of the things that came out of it was that there was far more damage from mental health issues than there was from radiation effects. And it lingers still. So it's a huge problem, and that's why mental health became part of the curriculum renewal and integration project. So, you know, he commented on needing a multidisciplinary team and the recognition that no one single discipline has all of the expertise, and they recognize that very quickly. So when we responded, we brought with us people from a number of different disciplines to support the work.
So related to that, what was striking to me is the story about blaming, about the in-culture blaming, and how the people who worked and the people who lived stumbling and you're really torn for making these decisions about whether to stay or whether to go based on a lack of information, and that the honestly made decisions at the time would end up dividing the area.
Sure, and what we were told, TEPCO, by the way, is the name of the nuclear power plant. So the TEPCO employees in the blue uniforms were the people that worked at the nuclear power plant. And the general feeling in the community was that if you were a TEPCO employee, then you were somebody who had a good job and made a lot of money. So when this happened, they were the target of blame. And in part, and he says this, the CEO was not physically present. And the government initially hadn't responded in the way that, you know, we all want governments to respond after any incident. In large part because they were dealing with an earthquake, a tsunami, and also a lack of communication. And they were trying to sort out for themselves what was going on, and then how much information and in what way do you share it with the public in a way that you don't create further stress. They were harshly criticized for their response. And so they responded to that response by flooding people with information that they were not able to fully understand, which just created more fear. So, you know, it's been a very difficult process to navigate. And all of those things were on the table. What else did you hear? Or think about?
So what struck me was the, especially the days that followed, you have a mental health care professional going to a location where everybody thinks they're going to die. And what I kept thinking was, how on earth do you triage that? And that's the prevalent feeling that everyone has. Where do you start? In the beginning days of this, I mean, a few years later now, and we're seeing the effects of PTSD and things like that. But in the immediate days that followed the event itself, where people literally thought they were going to die, how on earth do you even deal with that?
And he's been very open about sharing that's something that he struggled with. The volume of people, 2,000, he was estimating that he would be needing to somehow support, and knowing that he couldn't reach 2,000 people individually. I don't know if you caught that, you know, he said he was trained in disaster psychiatry, but this is the first time he'd actually been on site at a disaster. So talk about learning on your feet. And, you know, one of the things that struck me powerfully is that they've all been asking this question of what would you do? What would you do? And they had to ask it of themselves because they made decisions in the moment, whether they were staying or going into. So they all went through that process, and knowing that they didn't have full information about anything. A number of the stories actually document the lengths that they had to go to get from wherever they were to Fukushima with no trains and no roads. It was remarkable to think about the lengths that they went to get there and offer support. Anything else that struck you?
One of the things that struck me in terms of his discourse was the way in which it was so laden with what we would see as the language of social justice or social responsibility. And his, you know, as he's talking about the disaster, he's also expressing his concerns about the discrimination against the workers who were targeted in lieu of them being able to direct their attention to the CEO. And also his struggling with the sense that he felt people were maybe a little bit irrational around that, but, you know, he had to deal with the discrimination and those kinds of things. But then at the end he goes on to say, well, I'm not political, I don't let politics intervene in my work, when clearly they're all over his work. And then, you know, at the end he kind of says, well, yeah, I'm kind of political too. And so I did, just that whole discourse was just in and out, woven in and out of his whole description of what he was doing. I mean, his very act of going, choosing to go there is an act of social responsibility on the part of a professional and an academic who wouldn't be the first person I would think of as someone who would rush into a nuclear disaster.
And definitely, I mean, the people that we spoke to clearly had that social responsibility at their core because they stayed or came running in. So they were a unique group in that sense. But they spoke often about a lot of tensions, not just, being thrust and caught in a context where politics was very much at play and discrimination was very much at play. Many of them are still traumatized from their own histories of being children of A-bomb survivors, for example, and that trauma working through. And that he mentioned people being concerned that they would be stigmatized because they were from that region, so now they are the exposed, right? And the same thing happened after the A-bomb. And they were shunned, or they did have problems. Your child suddenly isn't going to grow up and marry into another family if you've come from a family that was exposed. So they really did link back to that history and think about that's what our future is now, and so we have no future. Our children have no future. So there were layers of issues that were at play here.
But there's that intercultural thing about honor too, right? He talks about restoring honor, which probably isn't something we would talk about in our context.
Yes, that was very powerful as well. Anybody else have any thoughts?
Yeah, I was surprised that you said that people felt that they were safe and that this wouldn't happen to them. The word tsunami is a Japanese word, and Japan has had tsunamis, earthquakes, volatility forever. It's great for you to look at the artwork of Hiroshige and Fukushima and whatnot. Tidal waves, tsunamis, and whatnot are part of it. And what I read in the press in the aftermath, what I could find was that people were quite stalwart, resigned. And that there was a sense that they knew that inevitably, as people say in San Francisco would know, but they would know even better because they've been through it so many times. It's bound to happen again, and you're just waiting for the next tsunami in some way. So I was surprised that you said that they hadn't learned or prepared. And also when I saw the layout of the city, right at sea level, and the location of the nuclear plant, I looked at it and thought, well, maybe they haven't learned from history. I mean, maybe it's just a fact they have to stay on those low lands, but I was confused as to what they expected was going to happen sooner or later, and that given the history,
Right.
they wouldn't be ready for it. So going back to education, have transmitted this information, and here's what we do, and here's how it plays out. But also in terms of education, in terms of city planning, and all the other things that go into it. It's not like Japan is a poor nation where they have to put up houses in extremely dangerous areas and so forth. So there was a strange mix of things there. I thought they know this is going to happen sooner or later, and yet they were surprised and not ready to deal with what was going to happen.
So not being the engineer or the nuclear disaster expert, what I was told when we visited was that there were some mistakes made in terms of building the power plants. For example, we were shown models of power plants that were built on top of a cliff. If they had been built on top of a cliff, the tsunami wouldn't have actually reached them. But it was a lot more expensive to build them up there than it was to build them down a little lower. And so that was one of the decisions that they realized obviously was not a good one. Whether the tsunami would have done the damage that we saw without the earthquake? I don't know, I can't answer. I was told that it was because of, the two together that this damage was done that caused the leak. And so I think a lot of them found it difficult to imagine lightning striking like that. But I think part of the other reason why they were so surprised was because of their history. When they chose to go into nuclear power plants, there's an international standard of radiation levels that get set and agreed upon, whether it's the IAEA or other organizations that also look at this. And Japan had theirs even lower than that. Their standard was lower than the international standard. So I think that they understood that they were, really tight with their regulations and their safety measures in place. And so I think it was that mindset that perhaps, when they look back on it, they're saying, we thought we had done everything right. And now they recognize that obviously, even with those regulations, nothing is 100% safe. As he said, we don't live in a 100% safe world or 100% danger. It's somewhere in between. One of the interesting things that I know when we're doing research, often researchers get asked to maintain anonymity or confidentiality of the people that they work with. The people that we worked with have said, no, we do not want to remain anonymous. We want our names shared. We want our voices heard. We want people to know what we've learned, and we want to be part of this process. They have stated that the time and the years of feeling shame and perhaps not speaking openly about these has passed for them. That they are trying to do everything as transparently as possible because this was so enormous that they feel, again, a responsibility to make sure that everything that they know they're sharing as openly as possible. And so I know you can't see that very well from the back, but this just gives you a sampling. We've got, vice presidents of universities, we've got nurses, we've got medical students, instructors, a real combination of people that came together in the face of the crisis. And so we brought a team that was diverse as well, as I mentioned. We had an ethicist, for example, who came to work with us. We had people who specialize in science and technology and society, which is a kind of curricular lens. But I want to just take you into, to get to know just a few of these folks, just to give you an idea. The person on the far left is Ari Hasegawa. Ari is delightful. He took us out on our second night there, and he said he was taking us for risky dinner at a sushi restaurant. And we were thinking, is that risky because maybe we shouldn't be eating sushi from Fukushima? Like what? No, it's risky because the restaurant wouldn't take reservations. So he didn't know with the number that we had in our party whether we'd be able to get in. That smile was on his face the entire time we were there. He was an ER physician. He happened to be about 10 miles away from Fukushima hospital when the earthquake hit. He was working with somebody who was hyperventilating. And immediately went back to Fukushima hospital. He had a background as a surgeon as well, but his knowledge of radiation at that time was, X-rays, how to do diagnostic testing using radiation safely. He had attended a nuclear disaster workshop 10 years earlier, but he said that he remembers very little of it except for the social part. And that, you know, they read textbooks, he got a textbook from it, and they went through a few tabletop exercises, but he had no experience with problem solving on his feet, leading of any kind, coordinating, directing, communication, all of those things. And when disaster struck and Fukushima Medical University became Grand Central Station for this crisis, he was suddenly in charge because he was the person that was there. And he figured out pretty quickly that you have to find out how to do this and make the best with what you've got. And his stories are incredible examples of courage and ingenuity. He's the first one to say he was panic-stricken, didn't sleep, didn't even see the explosion himself for a month on TV because he was too busy. They didn't stop for a long period of time. But he said for him it was a question of humanity and doing what's right, and people needed to be taken care of. And so his story was one that played a huge role in shaping his curriculum. The fellow beside him, Atushi Kumagai, Atushi is at Nagasaki, and he actually has radiation specialization. So he's the guy you want in Fukushima right now. He's in Nagasaki. But as soon as this happens, he thinks, oh, okay, I'm one of a handful of people with this specialization. I need to get there. So his entire focus was on getting from Nagasaki to Fukushima. And his story is one of the most interesting in terms of what he had to do to get physically from one place to another. And he says to me, I don't know what I was thinking. He said, I packed for 3 days, didn't even think to bring any food. Of course, they had no food, they had no water when he did get there. They had rice balls. The kitchen had managed to save up enough water when things were happening. They thought to fill all the kettles, and they saved up enough water to make a week's worth of rice balls, and that's what people lived on. So Atushi found his way there, and he became the specialist that looked after the healthcare professionals. Because Ari, as I said, didn't know. He didn't know how to decontaminate. He didn't know anything about what levels were safe, what weren't. None of the responders who were working with the patients that were coming in contaminated knew the answers to the questions they desperately wanted to know. Like, am I going to be okay? Are my kids going to be okay? So Atushi took over that component, and he developed protocols in the hospital to help them out. Ken, interesting fellow, Ken Nolet, he is, I always forget his specialty, a transfusion specialist. So he's teaching and researching at the university. He's an American. His government automatically orders him to evacuate. He says, no, I'm going to stay. I don't know what I can do. I'm a transfusion specialist, but I'm going to stay. And he starts realizing very quickly that there is all of this information that is being shared by people who are trying to interpret highly scientific knowledge into lay language, that there are groups of people that are panic-stricken, and he picks up his camera and starts going around and documenting photos from the event. And he's one of the people that put together this book. It's called Fukushima Lives on the Line, and it's filled with photographs and different reports and papers that people that were involved put together. But these three people became very critical in the work that we did because of their own self-awareness of what they realized and understood that they didn't know, and their requests for, what could we do? How could we change this? So how has the curriculum changed? Well, this is a picture of Ari in action. What we learned from the data was that traditional methods of teaching are still required. He still holds classes. He's got his little whiteboard there, and he's demonstrating how to use a dosimeter, which is to measure the radiation readings. He told us, however, that he was not trained to consider the big picture in terms of how all of these are situated and related to other specialties that they ended up coming in contact with just because of the chaos and the kinds of things that they were responding to. He said that he had done tabletop exercises, for example, where they had talked about, you know, if you bring a contaminated patient in, this is how you contaminate them, and you're good. The tabletop exercises never dealt with, however, the scenario that they were faced with, which was everything was contaminated. Okay? For a long period of time, the helicopters from private companies, for example, were grounded, and their pilots were sent, they were ordered not to fly into that zone. The military helicopters were being used for a number of different things, including trying to get some water to Fukushima, because I think I mentioned we need water to decontaminate. And so they weren't being used to transport patients. So you had both military and regular ambulances going in and picking up or coming from that region, completely covered in radioactive material, and arriving at your hospital door. So they had to change the way they did things. So this is a group of young students, the radiation or physicians of the future, and he's working to change the way that he teaches them. One of the things that they recognized was the need for interdisciplinarity. So they recognized that, okay, we're trying to do this. There's no extra room ever afforded in a curriculum, as many of us in this room know. So you have to figure out how to make good use of resources that we have available. Public health nurses and OBGYN physicians often went into the communities. They are used to working with communities. They're used to working with mothers. They do public education. So they had curricula and infrastructure built already, and access to various, public coordinators to create an outreach program. So it was an easy merger to say, here's a place where we can do some overlapping curricular work to bring one group from that university already together and learn from one another and look at how you do things differently. Ari mentioned to me that he knew that there was a room in the hospital somewhere where there was some material for radiation safety, but he'd never set foot in that room. Well, this isn't that room. They ended up having to make a room, but they had equipment, thankfully. So this, with the help of Atushi, they put together this particular spot, and you can see that there's all kinds of materials on this table, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. This particular area of the floor is taped off, and all of these material drawers are taped closed. There's plastic on the back. So people were brought in, they were triaged and brought into this room if they were found to be needing decontamination. This is a decontamination tub where people are placed into if they need to be decontaminated. They had no water, so it was not used for, I think, the first week until their water supplies were back on. So this is one of the things that's changed. Here are the students who normally would have learned a little bit about this in textbooks. Now they actually have to open these packages up. They have to put these outfits on, and they have to learn how to put them on properly. They have to be sealed. So this fellow is a nurse who came in from Nagasaki. His mother was a Naval survivor. And he came in to help. And so he's teaching them how to put their own safety equipment on. And then they have to spend the rest of the day working in that equipment so that they understand what the conditions are like for their own safety. You'll notice that on the back of the outfit, that is their name. That's part of the protocol, so that if there was another catastrophe, they would be more easily identifiable. These seem like little things, but the tone that it sets in the context of their training was palpable. And this fellow is Professor of Chushu, and he is the director of radiation medicine at Fukushima Medical University. He recognized that people that came from other places sometimes were in the middle of studies. This fellow happened to be one of 2 nurses in a radiation program. And he left his master's studies to go to this program, or to go and help. And by the way, none of these people have gone home. Over 4 years later, they're still there. So this fellow has set up a graduate program for all of these folks because he recognized that these are our leaders in disaster management in the future. So that's one of the other, that's just an aside that came out of it. Here they are, they're suited up. Now they have to face a brand new scenario. All of the people that were brought in with contamination were brought into an outdoor triage area. These folks are now going to be required to go to that area not knowing what they're going to find. And so they have to mimic exactly the kinds of things that Ari was faced with. So here they are outside. This fellow is Sim Sam. And they're not told what is going on with Sim Sam. They don't know if he's contaminated or not. They don't know what kinds of injuries he has. And so they're watching how they approach him, what they touch, what kinds of questions they ask, what they deal with first. And here's Ari showing he's found some radiation contamination on this fellow's right leg. So they have to decide, which do we do first? So they're trying to create scenarios that mimic real life trauma. Just to give you a sense of what was going on in the community around this region. When the tsunami hit and the plume of radioactive material was released into the environment, for a little while they thought maybe they were going to be okay and it was heading out over the sea. Not that that was a good thing, but best of 2 options, I suppose. But the wind shifted and it came back and it came over the land and was rained onto a fairly large region. So they had to go through and clean and decontaminate the actual land. Ground was scraped in school playgrounds, in fields, everywhere. It was completely scraped away until they were down below where they could measure cesium, which is the radioactive material. It was stored in large walled-off containers like this. So you can see here they have codes on each of these containment areas, and inside there are mounds and mounds of scraped earth that are contaminated. And so they go in, they measure them with a dosimeter, and then those readings get logged, and they keep track of just exactly what's going on. At some point, this material has to be put somewhere. They're still having discussions about where that's going to go. The last that I heard was that they may take it back into the most contaminated area to try to locate it all. But I mean, at this point, moving it is also an issue. So there isn't a great situation all the way around. In this picture, we're at City Hall. This is another response to the psychological stress that was experienced. So in City Hall, they've set up a system where your garden is producing food, or you buy it at the grocery store. Either one. You don't know whether it's safe. You can take it into City Hall, give it to this fellow, they put it in a machine, and they take readings to see whether or not there is any radiation coming from it. And then they post the results on a database that anybody in the community can look it up. So if I have not checked my own food, but I know my neighbor has, I might feel more confident that mine's probably okay. And that's still happening. People, that lettuce had come in the day that we were there. So people are still checking. Similarly, this is a machine that was put into place in the rice processing plants. The rice crops were not harvested until a number of months after the accident, but I mean, this is a big part of their economy, and not a single grain of rice was not checked. So they put this in place, and then each bag of rice has this barcode on it, and then consumers have an app that they can download, and you can go into a store and you can scan the rice and see exactly what day it was checked, what the reading level was, and you know, we talked earlier about Shun's comment about restoring honor. One of the people in our group said, well, you know, why didn't they just say that it wasn't from Fukushima? And he said, because we are not doing that. It's all about saying it is from Fukushima and it's okay. And it's about bringing back honor and pride to a very damaged area. This is a dosimeter that is available. They're all over the place. They're all over the community. It's a way for the public walking around on a daily basis to take a look and say, okay, the readings are okay, they're safe. Medical health professionals were provided with dosimeters so they could check their own readings. Evacuees wear personal dosimeter devices so that they can check their readings daily. And part of that is to combat the stress and reassure them. The evacuees. These are stories that we're still working on, actually. I know that's a bit of a dark picture, but if you can imagine living in a coastal town, many of them farmers, beautiful. They were active. They were in communities, close to family. And this is temporary housing. 4 years later, they're still there. You can see that there's not a lot for people to do. They're small. There's no garden to tend even. They were separated from family members, from communities. And so that has also complicated and contributed to some of the problems. However, they're trying to rebuild new communities. This is one of the coastal evacuees. He was quite delightful to speak to. He was 92 years old. And told us how he had just missed being in the war, built his own house. He liked to tell people that because he built his own house, that's why it's still standing. But it was just slightly outside of the casino zone. But he talks about going to bed, literally one day, waking up and going out his front door the next day and everything being gone. Everything gone. He's one of the evacuees that's working with urban planners and others, trying to reimagine new places for these evacuees to live. They're not going to be going home. So they're trying to build communities that have a shared common space, some kind of garden, but that has a mixture of apartment buildings for young married couples, for example, or young people that don't want to live with their parents, but also people who are going to need long-term care and support, whether it's for mental health issues. Drinking has become, or other addictions have become a big problem because they have nothing to do. In many cases, they're sitting there and they feel like they've lost everything. And so unfortunately, some of these other things take over. So they're trying to rebuild communities and imagine them in ways that bring people back together. I wanted to point this little character out because as we were talking about curriculum, we have he's now deceased, but a Canadian-Japanese curriculum expert by the name of Ted Aoki. And when Ted came over and started working in Canada, one of the first things that he noticed was our focus on individualism. And it was at odds with his understanding of the self and other, because in his culture, you can't have one person without two people. So that particular sign is called a hito, two graphic strokes which represent that it takes two to make one. And when you talked earlier about this cultural social responsibility, that's embedded within the way that they view one another and their responsibility to one another. And in the curricular work, I found it very interesting because what I heard in the stories was what we call in the curricular world the planned curriculum. Those documents and plans and tests that we write before we've ever met our students. And then there's the lived curriculum, which is what actually takes place and what happens when people come into our classrooms, when we come to know their knowledge and skills and expertise and so on, their experiences, and each shapes the other. And so this became a little bit of a symbol for us as we were working through how to reconceptualize the curriculum. We worked together to create this, it's called a handbook at the IAEA. For me, it's a little bit of a philosophical orientation that starts from the science, technology, and society curricular lens, but it embeds ways that these folks can take some of what we've done with them and integrate it into their own context. Obviously, there isn't a single curriculum that's going to get added on. Everybody that was there is teaching a different course, a different content area. But there was quick recognition that, as I mentioned before, that they required cooperation and work with other specialties. So, for example, we brought in people from communications who specialize in that area. And one of the things that we had them do, you heard Jean mention it, is take that expert knowledge that you have and bring it down into something that can be shared, whether it's a pamphlet that gets sent out to kindergarten teachers who want to know if it's safe to let the kids out at recess, or whether it's nursing mothers who want to know if it's safe to nurse their children, to make some kind of information packet or media release or interview. We took cameras and had them practice. That was enormous for them because they had not ever done that. I experienced it myself. I had, when I was at the IEA the summer before going to Japan, they came into my office and they said, we want you to explain the differences between the radiation dosage levels. And I said, pardon? Teacher, remember? And they said, no, that's exactly why we want you to do it. None of us can speak anything but our own scientific jargon, and we want you to explain this as if you were talking to your grandmother. And then they dumped a bunch of books and scientific documents on my desk that I worked through for a while until I grasped enough of an understanding to be able to say, okay, now I get it. Now I understand what this dosage means in our world, because it's not just in Fukushima. It was a real eye-opener, but a very good exercise. So it wasn't just learning that went one way. This is a quote that I think resonates with certainly everyone that I worked with. They were shocked that I would come to Fukushima because most people are afraid to go to Japan, apparently. They're having real issues with tourism. I think probably because of the earlier exercise that I did where I had to understand the levels and dosage and safe doses, I had no problems going at all, but this is still very much a lingering issue. So I think that is where I'm going to leave it and see if you've got questions or any thoughts that have come to mind. It was an absolute pleasure to work with these people. We go back the end of June to pick up where we left off. They're busy creating all kinds of teaching resources with what we have done in December, and we're looking at bringing those into a digital space where they can be shared. And their goal is eventually to become leaders in radiation disaster globally. So they're trying to develop a curriculum where they can take this experience and share it with the world. Any questions?
Just open up the floor.
Kathy, what is the metric used to determine the safe levels of radiation? I saw you and your mom standing beside a sign.
It's a millisievert. There is more than one, but that's the general unit that they use.
Should we be concerned that we are so close to you right now?
I wondered if somebody might ask a question about radiation levels. So this is a little graphic that gives you some idea of what the different levels are. So you can see on the left, you have all different forms of naturally occurring radiation. And remember that when this incident happened, you know how doctors always say there's no evidence? Well, there's no evidence because they have not had this situation before. So it's not that the studies have been done and shown that there's no evidence. There is no evidence. The closest thing that they have is looking at naturally occurring radiation. And believe it or not, there are places in Brazil, there's also a place in, I believe it's Iran, that have higher doses of radiation than what they're being exposed to in Japan. They're absolutely naturally occurring because of the geology. So there are all kinds of ways that we can get it. I mean, every time you go on an airplane, and it accumulates in your body. Okay, so of course there are also all of the diagnostic tests that we make use of, and so there are levels that are set that we say it's not safe to be exposed to any more than this level, and then they have higher exposures for those that work with radiation, like physicians, because the assumption is that they have been properly trained to wear the lead vests and to, be behind that special wall and to protect themselves. And they keep it significantly lower than where it starts, than the point where they have evidence that it's dangerous. Now, that's not to say that you're okay up till then. They don't know. They don't want you getting close to that. But that's part of what caused a little bit of trouble. I mentioned earlier that Japan had set its standard lower than the international level. So when the crisis occurred, and they said, well, actually, this is okay, this higher level is okay, you can imagine the response. People were completely not trusting what was coming out because the standard had been here. How can you suddenly raise it here? You're not telling us the truth. So there was a lot of conflicting information. There were a lot of rumors. Rumors were very harmful, devastating to some farmers. I think there was a Japanese manga that was created that was starting a rumor about contamination of crops, fish, all kinds of things. So that was as damaging as some of the natural disasters.
too, there's a really interesting actor in your story that I've never heard before, and it's the disintegrating atom. That you have access to all sorts of different stories from the disintegrating atom, from the terrifying to your work in radiology, where it's like it's the savior.
Yes.
It's such a strange nexus.
It is a strange nexus, and it's one that the IAEA deals with all the time, right? Because they are about atoms for peace. The group I work with is in the Division of Human Health, so it's about using nuclear power for human health services. And they walk that tension because they go into countries where they're using or producing nuclear energy for military purposes, and have to try to work with them to think about using it for peaceful purposes. So that tension is there.
I'm curious about the potential movement in curriculum to have interdisciplinarity actually practiced at the university around safety assessments and events like that. So that these one-offs where there's learning from each other, or that document where it was never brought together, but curriculum is already so set that no one has room to add this interdisciplinary piece.
Oh, maybe I misspoke. What I meant was there's no room to add an additional course that focuses on just disaster management, in the sense that, and that was a comment that I made in part because we always have things that we'd like to add to our curriculum as well, and we find that room for one more course often doesn't exist. And so what we end up doing is we integrate that learning throughout. An example of that is, when we were first looking at English language learners and culturally and linguistically diverse learners, we used to have these one-off courses that people could take, and they'd either be a series of additional workshops, then they might become a part of a course, but eventually they find their way into and across most courses. So it's that kind of idea that these people are coming in from all kinds of specializations. A single, even interdisciplinary course isn't going to meet all of their needs. What we needed to do was work together to see where we could build on strengths that one another brought to that group, so that they go back, and we worked with them on this process, and we'll continue to next month. But they go back and they redesign the curriculum that they have to integrate the changes that we discussed as a group into their core curriculum. So the curriculum gets reconceptualized in a way that takes into account the lived experiences of these first responders, and it changes them. And I can give you some examples. Culturally, what they told me, and I saw, was that Japanese students do not typically debate, argue, speak up in the context of their instructors or anyone that's considered on a hierarchy, a superior, whether it's age, status, rank, whatever. And they realized that's a problem, in this case anyway. And so they knew that they needed to develop a set of skills that they didn't have. And so one of the things that we did was we created scenarios that brought that into being. And it was difficult. I mean, you saw the list of all of our participants. Well, the first couple of days that we were there, the entire group, so if they were the vice president of the university or whatever, they were also there, and government officials, officials from the IAEA, they were all there because this was a collaborative project. But as the week wore on, those folks went back to work, and we were left with the physicians that were going to be educating their students and that were reconceptualizing their curriculum. So before the large group left, they said, can you give us a sample of some of the things that you're going to do with these folks the last few days? And we said, sure. on the spot. So we came up with one of the activities, which was taken from one of the narratives, where it was involving the tough decision of do I stay or do I go, and how do I make that call. And it was done with the ethicist in our group. We pulled them up, we do something, I'm sure, I'm looking around at the room of people that I've taught, because I've used this a few times, but it's called the human graph, where you create any kind of a decision that has to be made, and it's got two ends of the continuum. And they have to physically take a stand on the graph, whether they're closer to this idea or closer. And so you can bring in any, like you can raise a really contentious issue like should nuclear power be turned back on in Japan? Yes or no? And you can imagine. And our students, the students that I've worked with, they jump up. They're on that line, and they've all got opinions. Whether they're informed or not is another story, but they've all got opinions. This group, however, asked for this, and then when we said, okay, this is what we're going to do, they looked shell-shocked. And they said, they did do it, but they were extremely quiet. And so we had to work with them to get them to start talking. And I remember thinking, this is going to be a challenging week. But that was just a short glimpse, a preview, I guess. And then we went back to that exercise after all of the other officials had left, and they were in there chatting with no problem. And I said, okay, what just happened? And they said, oh, we can't speak in front of our superiors. It's disrespectful. And they said that, having already said to us in interviews that this is a problem. And so then we had to practice that and look at how can we do this in a way that's both respectful but gives us an opportunity to raise the things that we're concerned about and to talk through and work through some of these really big decisions that they had to make. Yes?
I'm just curious about this. And obviously, every enterprise has emergency preparedness plans. Do you have an evaluation about the on-site emergency preparedness plans? The preparedness plans have any effect to limit situations, disaster are Fukushima? And because I believe, because every accident can be unexpected. From the history can be repeated in ways. In that way, so we can know how to improve our preparedness plans in next time, or we have calculation about next time the disaster happens, in which degree we can alleviate it in the next time.
That's a really good question, and it's definitely one of the issues that came up, because one of the things that they found out very quickly, and they call them autopsies on the past events, right? So they go back and they look at how did this work or not work, and what do we need to do differently. So an evaluation of that kind. One of the things that they realized was that all kinds of, we're not just talking about disciplinary academic people, all kinds of people were needed in this response. My focus here is very narrow on the first medical responders, but you can imagine the road crews, for example, so transportation generally, communication generally, the disaster management team, there's a DMAT team, and the DMAT team ended up coming in and helping get casualties from the site to the hospital. But what they realized was that there was no overarching coordination of all of those various responders that were needed. So that's one of the big lessons that they learned from this response, that they've already taken some action on and are continuing to try and improve at every level. So each one of them individually, and then in an overarching coordinating way. We see, for example, Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Fukushima are all working together now. And before that, they all had their expertise. It's not that they didn't know one another or work together, but the collaboration has changed, and it's at a level that wasn't occurring in the past. So I think we're going to see more of coordinated effort in a unified way. I think that there has been much written individually about failures on the part of many different groups. And this is an important lesson that I certainly take out of it, and that these folks are saying to me as well, is that we have to stop looking at failure as something that is shameful and needs to be hidden. We have to look at it as a learning opportunity. And or we're not going to change what we do in the future. And so the evaluation of individual programs, it's a very interesting question, because they don't evaluate them all in similar ways either. And that's a focus that they're also looking at, is how do we assess? We each have these different protocols for assessing. Are those protocols any good anymore in light of this overarching issue where we needed to be coordinated? So it's an area that there are lots of groups working on. Tom?
Building on that, so you read about Katrina, which has not the nuclear component, but the same leveling of non-coordination of resources and so forth. So are there any plans downstream in the work that you're doing in Japan to make this information more available across a variety of jurisdictions?
Yes, so the Fukushima Medical University is hoping that all of this work will feed into global disaster education. And I think, the one fellow that spoke was talking about how, he was drawing on what he learned from SARS and H1N1 and, any of those kinds of things that he had some knowledge of. So it was a recognition that we have much to learn from one another's disasters or serious events. And there is a goal to build a global disaster curriculum. But they don't want to build it out of, the work is underway. Anyone else?
Anybody else?
You know the story about the one guy who's gone back into the evacuation zone to care for the animals? Is he gonna die? What's the radiation level like, and why have the animals survived?
Okay, so I know that story. I know it because the psychiatrist that I played the audio tape for you has actually gone and talked to this fellow. I can't answer the question about is he going to die and why haven't the cattle died, because I can't answer those questions. They know nothing is growing there, so he can't grow his own food there. He can't grow food for the cattle to eat. His response to why he's there is because that is his life. He's decided that he's going to stay there for as long as he lives, and that he's not going to kill his cattle because his cattle are an artifact of that disaster. And if and when they die, they will die, but he will not kill them. I wish I could answer. I don't know.
But he's feeding the
Rebecca.
dogs too, because that's one of the things, right? People had to leave their pets behind.
Yeah.
And then you talk about the social problems and the things where they're living in essentially little portholes and stuff. If they'd been allowed to take their pets, they would probably be in better shape mentally.
For sure. Oh, I think, my guess from pictures that I've seen is that there was no room to take pets. They barely could get all of the people loaded into evacuation buses, taxis, everything that they could get moving, and not all of them would go there. So transporting them out was an issue as well. I also know that the radiation dose levels in a lot of the areas have significantly reduced and leaving, they would fall below what's considered safe. But in the tsunami affected area, for example, it's just not, it's not safe for people to be there for lots of reasons. And definitely the perimeter around the nuclear power plant is not safe. So whether that fellow lives for a long time or not, I can't answer because they don't have evidence to know what that level of exposure, which is much lower than the bomb or Chernobyl, but over a longer period of time, they don't know the effects. Time will tell, research will tell.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much, Kathy. I started at the beginning saying, you know, you hear about a catastrophe like that in the newspaper and it's there for a couple of weeks. And then you just wonder what happened and you provided the aftermath, which is where probably the most important stuff comes, the learning experiences and so on. So thanks for going there. It must be a traumatic experience to go and see it happening. Maybe and something that shows hope because people are getting on with it and they're learning from it and moving forward. But it takes courage to go and
Well,
do it.
it doesn't feel like courage when you see the courage that they showed.
Sure. Yeah. But thank you very much for presenting and for going and doing that research. Thanks again to Kathy.